A definition of freedom. Freedom is one of the most interesting concepts, and at the same time, probably one of the most misunderstood and abused terms that we have in the English language. It is an extremely important idea. Incidentally, we have another word that means much the same thing: liberty. In fact, the English language is particularly rich in this particular, because we do have two words that mean essentially the same: liberty and freedom. Many languages only have one, depending on where they are geographically, and there are a number of languages, more or less primitive languages, which do not have the word at all and hence do not have the concept of liberty. The word freedom has a very interesting history. So far as we are able to learn at the present time, at least, the word freedom first appears in writing about 2000 BC, nearly 4,000 years ago. It is found in a writing by a man named Autarchy in the Mesopotamian village of Lagash. Autarchy, in writing at that time, and this particular writing will appear in a book by a man named Meyer, and the name of the book is History Begins at Sumer, S-U-M-E-R, History Begins at Sumer by Meyer. And the author here tells us, and he is a Sumeriologist, that is, he's one of the few men alive who can translate the Sumerian cuneiform script, which is what he's dealing with. He tells us that this particular essay by Autarchy comes from Lagash and relates to a condition that Autarchy found in Lagash at the time he wrote. Autarchy said that the people in Lagash were losing their freedom. And the reason that they were losing their freedom, he said, was because they had a new political leader who was sort of an alien. And he had increased the taxes and the regulations and was engaged in virtually enslaving the entire market area. People couldn't exchange or produce without paying a remarkably higher and ever higher taxes to this politician. And Autarchy offered himself more or less as a reform candidate, indicating that if he could become king, why, he would change all this, and the taxes would be repealed, and everything would get back to the way he remembered it as being before. I don't know, and Mayer doesn't make it clear just how it occurred, but apparently Autarchy won the election, or whatever they had at that time, because he became the ruler of Lagash, perhaps after he had made this literary appeal in the essay that has been unearthed. In any case, apparently the recovery that Autarchy invoked, and indeed he did so, because the essay contains this element. It explains that after Autarchy came to power, the taxes were repealed, the laws were modified, the regulations were put aside, and there was something in the nature of an economic recovery in Lagash for a while. But apparently it was too little or too late, or both, because about 10 years after Autarchy comes to power, Lagash simply ceases to exist. It is blotted from the pages of history and has never returned. Now, just what caused that, we don't know. Probably there was an invasion from an outside force. It may have been aided and abetted by some type of economic collapse from within. We simply don't have enough data to know exactly what did occur. We only know that Autarchy is the last ruler of Lagash, that he came to power as a reform candidate somehow, and put in the reforms according to this essay. And this is where we first find the word freedom in writing. I think that's fascinating. To think that the first time the word appears in literature is in a complaint about high taxes. I think, it's an interesting thing about people. We tend to value the things that we don't have. And when men are relatively free, they don't really value freedom. because they're not really aware that they have it. It's just like a man who has a good well and a plentiful supply of water. It's not particularly valuable to him because it's right there and he has all that he wants and can use. But then when the well runs dry, or when the person doesn't have his freedom, then he begins to really evaluate it very highly, and the less he has of it, the more important it seems to become to him. And I think this, in a sense, is the way we work as people. I think it could be expressed with the little jingle that perhaps you remember. As a rule, a man's a fool. When it's hot, he wants it cool. When it's cool, he wants it hot, always wanting what is not. And that's just a little way of explaining how our value system works. We value things that are scarce, and the more scarce they become, if they have a high utility to us, the more we value them. In fact, they become priceless. And yet if we have an abundance of the same thing, it becomes less and less valuable to us, and we are sated by it, and finally we grow indifferent to it. And in a sense, this has been the nature of freedom. So anyway, we have the word arising there in the Middle East, in Mesopotamia, perhaps around 2000 BC. From that time on, the word has a sort of a migration. It is picked up in other languages. It crosses toward the north, and we find words that are derived from the same stem arising in the Balkan languages, in the Germanic languages, in the Slavic languages, and ultimately in the Norse languages. There is a very similar word or words that all come from the same root. And somewhere in process, it also gets into English. Now, whether it comes into English from very early sources in the Akkadian and Sumerian tongue, or whether it gets there from the Germanic or the Norse languages, I don't know. We only know that the word freedom does get into English, and that's generally the way it has migrated. It originated in the Middle East and then seemed to go north, and possibly north and west. Now, the word liberty, on the other hand, is of Greek origin, or possibly pre-Greek. As to that, I cannot be sure at the moment. Certainly, it is a Greek word, or a word of Greek origin. The Greeks used it. It was translated from the Greek into the Latin, and the Romans used it. They used the word liberty, not the word freedom. The French picked it up from the Latin, and they have a word for liberty. And then the English language got it either from the French or the Latin. And so in English we have both words, the word of liberty and the word of freedom, and both mean essentially the same thing. The concept apparently was more or less a commonly held concept dating to a very early time in human experience, and this is how the concept was originally. Etymologically speaking, it was formed with this thought in mind, that freedom is a condition that relates to the in-group. That is, within a clan or a tribe, or if you like, within the phratries or the gens, the people there are free. That is to say, they are not under suspicion. They can do as they please. We trust them because they're part of our group. But everybody outside of our group must be viewed with suspicion and potential enmity because they are not free. Thus, freedom was not viewed as a general condition or even a condition that could be considered as desirable on any kind of a general base. It was simply a privileged condition. We thought of it that way, as a privilege inhering to those persons who are on the inside. They're a part of our family. They're a part of our particular culture. Then, of course, in the early days, what would happen would be an individual would perhaps come into a territory where he was not a member of the in-group, and he would be taken in very much under suspicion. He would be watched, possibly treated very badly for a while, until we began to trust him, at which point there would usually be an adoption ceremony, and he'd be adopted into the tribe. Actually, what would happen would be that at the moment of his adoption, he is granted freedom. That is, the freedom is bestowed upon him that would be the same kind of condition that would exist among the other members of the tribe. He's accepted as a brother, and then has freedom the same as everyone else. So actually, the word related to a privileged condition at the outset. Now, with the passing of time, people began to apply the word in a more broadened sense. It related to a general condition in which two or more people could be together, and no rules would be invoked on anybody. In other words, the concept then developed as follows, that if two men are in the same general locality, and neither man imposes force or interferes with the will of the other man, then a condition of freedom pertains. However, the minute one person takes control of the second person, then we have lost the concept of freedom, and something other than freedom exists. Now, it would be very easy to see that the word freedom then has a moral connotation. It would exist in what I have called the moral theater, which is the area of human behavior in which interpersonal relationships occur. And freedom only has application in that area. Obviously, if we have a man alone on an island and there's no other person there, he would really have no use for the word freedom. Of course he would be free. There would be no one there to inhibit him. So naturally his freedom is not in question, and the idea that he is free or might not be free would perhaps never even occur to him. It would be the same as, say, the word theft. What use would the word theft be to a man on an island by himself? The concept is inconceivable because theft would be impossible. These words that have moral contexts always relate to an interhuman relationship. So when we think of a condition of freedom, we think of a condition in which more than one person is present, but none of the persons present impose their wills on any of the other persons. And that would be a condition of freedom. Now, it is obvious that the opposite of the word freedom, at least in one sense, is the word slavery. If a person is enslaved, well, certainly he cannot be free. And it follows that if he is free, he is not a slave. These would be mutually exclusive terms. And I think we recognize that. Most people have had a very strong feeling of antipathy toward slavery. We don't like it. We don't like it for ourselves. We certainly don't approve of the condition generally. We are opposed to slavery. At least we're in the record books as opposing slavery. We certainly favor freedom. And yet this word is subject to all kinds of interpretations. In fact, I think there's a very profound difference of view here. Possibly Abraham Lincoln put his finger on this difference about as well as anyone has ever done it. I can't quote him precisely here, and I don't have the quote handy, but he did say at one point that the world needed a good definition of freedom or liberty. I don't remember which word he used. I think he used liberty. But he said the world was very much in need of a good definition of liberty. And apparently we were somewhat confused about it, because with some, the word meant the right of a man to do as he pleases with himself and the products of his labor. And with others, it seemed to mean the right of a man to do as he pleased with other men and the products of other men's labor. And clearly, here are two different and contrary things, and yet we tend to call them both by the same name. Obviously, that is merely to confuse meanings, and we better have different names. And if the one is freedom, then its opposite must be slavery. And of course, I think we've pretty well accepted that view as Mr. Lincoln expressed it, and let me go on record as accepting it right now. I think freedom, in essence, means that a man may do as he pleases with himself and whatever it is that he owns, and I think that if a man does something with another man, or with something that the other man owns, that is not freedom or liberty, that in fact I would have to refer to it as license. It is something else again. Now, in trying to find a good definition for freedom, possibly the best and the most succinct definition that I've ever heard has been this: it is a human condition in which there is a total absence of coercion. And I have no real objection to that definition, providing only that it is thoroughly understood. I'd like to show you where the danger is in that definition unless it is thoroughly discussed and grasped. You see, freedom is a condition that occupies a middle ground. It is, in essence, a medium of human exchange. It's a little bit like money, only it's not money, of course. It's a condition that makes exchange possible between people. It's a word that relates to this interhuman relationship. Now, we are aware that slavery is the opposite of freedom. If a man is a slave, clearly he is not free. And if he is free, clearly he is not a slave. But now there's another meaning here too, and that relates to a word we could use. Let's use the word tyranny. There are other words that would apply, but let's just use this one. The tyrant is the person who creates the slave. But very few of us think of the tyrant as being a person who has lost his freedom. Rather, we think of the tyrant as a person who has full freedom. In fact, he may be having a little more freedom than the average person, because he's not only free to do as he pleases with himself, but he's free to do as he pleases with another person. And so we don't think of the tyrant as being the antithesis of freedom. Rather, we think of the tyrant as being another free man. But now we have two types of free men. We have a free man who is neither a tyrant nor a slave, and then we have a free man who is a tyrant but not a slave. Now, clearly, that would have to confuse us, because then when we say a free man, we don't know whether we're referring to a non-slave, or possibly we might be referring to a tyrant who is a non-slave, because there could be two types of non-slaves. There could be a free non-slave, and there could be a tyrant non-slave. So our language hasn't quite made this point clear. I would like to stress the fact that the real enemy of freedom isn't the slave. The slave is merely the victim of a lack of freedom. The real enemy of freedom is the tyrant, but we usually don't think of the tyrant as being opposed to freedom. In fact, let me tell you what we do. When we think we're in danger of being enslaved, our natural tendency is to try to become a tyrant over the guy that we think might enslave us. So we become the prime foe of freedom in an effort not to lose freedom. We become the very force that enslaves others in order to prevent us from being enslaved. Now, clearly, that is not an absence of coercion. That is coercion. But somehow, we don't see that very well. We recognize coercion when the other fellow is invoking it. But when we invoke it on the other fellow, well, that's justified, and it's not really coercion, you see. And this is precisely the problem. We are very, very much opposed to slavery, but we are not nearly as opposed to the practices that create it. The reason is that we don't want to be a slave, but we really don't object to being a tyrant. If only we could be a successful tyrant and enslave everybody else, why, how great that would be, because then we really would be free. And now we've made a complete circle intellectually and have gone back to the early primitive times where the word freedom is not a word relating to a general condition, but is only a word relating to a particular in-group, and we will use all the force we need to make everybody else a slave just so that we'll be free, and we call this the process of making certain that we are free. Isn't that appalling? Clearly, it is not freedom that we are talking about. We are merely talking about our license to have power over the other fellow for any one of a whole series of reasons that we could easily drum up. Our ability as rational beings relates to our fundamental ability to infer and to rationalize a situation in our own favor. And so we could create arguments by the score to justify the enslaving of other people because, one, they have a different background. Therefore, they could not be free because their freedom could endanger us. Or maybe they're of a different race, so clearly they should be enslaved. Or perhaps they have different economic resources. Or perhaps they speak a different language. Or perhaps they have a different religion. Or whatever difference they may have, they must belong to some other group. And it's only our group that is entitled to freedom. So freedom is going to be the privileged situation that we have within our own boundaries. And everybody else can be enslaved because that makes us free. And I would like to suggest that freedom means the absence of slavery, not the absence of your enslavement or my enslavement, but the absence of the condition of slavery. And that means the absence of the condition of tyranny, because freedom is a condition. It is a condition between men in which slavery and tyranny are absent. Coercion is absent all the way around. When you have that, then you have freedom. Now, we're talking in terms of trying to find a world, trying to create a social arrangement that will be beneficial, that will tend to upgrade human living, that will create a far more meaningful way of our getting along with each other. We've discovered that wherever you have aggression or the imposition of tyranny, you have frustration. The frustration leads to other aggression. And we have this interrelationship of cause and effect between frustration leading to aggression, aggression then leading to frustration, and back and forth we go. What we want to do is to get to a social arrangement in which we minimize these things and hopefully eliminate them totally. We can only do so in a context of freedom. Today, many people are afraid of freedom. And I can certainly sympathize with them and understand why. Because there are so many people running around who are equating freedom with their right to do as they please with other people and with other people's property. And of course, this is not freedom. This is license. This is to invoke tyranny. But the cure being offered is to enslave them so that they can't do it, and that's tyranny too. That is not the way to proceed. The correct way to proceed is to recognize that danger to freedom comes from either side. And the free man makes up his mind that he will be free through processes that do not involve either his becoming a slave or his becoming a tyrant. So the free man will simply not participate in any kind of an action which would cause him to be a part of an enslavement process. Now, curiously, this is fascinating to me. Curiously, it's easier to avoid becoming a tyrant than to avoid becoming a slave. Because the tyrant is made with my energy, and I can control my own energy. But the slave is made by somebody else's energy, you see. And so I have control of my own energy, and I can definitely decide that I will not be a tyrant. Whether or not I'm enslaved is another question, and naturally I don't want to be enslaved. But if I can ever get it through my head that I can deal with other people in such a way that I can retain my freedom, and in process not enslave or inhibit them, not coerce them, then I'm on the right track. And that is precisely what I think we must do. Now, the interesting thing, if we understand the nature of man sufficiently well, we can detect practical steps, practical ways and means wherein we can avoid this universal tendency that we've had for perhaps 10,000 years to try to preserve our own freedom at the expense of everyone else, and instead move practically and realistically along a line that will take us into a condition where we simply operate in freedom without invoking coercion on anyone, and at the same time without being willing to accept coercion on ourselves. That's the point. You know, it's interesting. Man begins, as many scholars say at least, in a state of nature. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't want to debate, but let me assume that it's true for purposes of making this illustration. Clearly it is true that man begins his experience in this world we live in a condition where he's not organized, and we can call this a state of nature. That is, however many men there may be, they live in a condition where they are dealing directly with nature, and they aren't organized, and quite frankly, when they aren't organized at all, where nothing has been put together properly, they are a marginal existence case. They can hardly make it. They need the help of each other. They need to get organized. They're in a condition of freedom. Oh, sure. Completely free. There's no organization. There's no arrangement. There's no contract. There's nothing to prevent them from being free. So they're free. But they don't value freedom because they've got a lot of it. What they value is organization. So then they get busy and they start organizing. And they organize how to put the pieces together so that they get precise and predictable results, which is what they want, what they've got to have. And as they do this, then they become impatient and they want to organize more and get more and more results, because this is the way you get results. You put the pieces together. And so we become impatient of each other. We are no longer necessarily content by working with the man when he wants to work with us, but we say, let's use a little coercion on this guy because his participation in what I'm doing is so terribly important. So then we begin forcing him a little and pressuring him, and pretty soon we build up organizations that are structured, that are governmentally oriented, and we become more and more imbued with this type of activity until presently we wake up and we're way down the line, way over here on the other side, and now we've got organization. Oh boy, are we organized. But where's freedom? We lost it somewhere in process. And so now we don't have that. And remember, what we don't have becomes very valuable. So we discover that freedom is gone, and we say, gee whiz, we've got to get our freedom again. And so we begin to squirm and wiggle, and we begin smashing up organizations or getting out of them because we can't stand the pressure and the oppression that they invoke here because they've been done incorrectly. And presently, we either overthrow the organization that we have, or we expel ourselves from it, and then we sweep back all the way across, and we come into a condition of non-organization where, again, we're free. And the minute we get there, we say, wow, we're in trouble. We don't have any economic goodies anymore. Let's get organized. And so we start the same process again, and this is precisely what humankind has done for millennia. We've gone back and forth between the extremes of non-organization and freedom on the one hand, and tight, compulsive organization and non-freedom on the other hand. Now, somewhere in the middle is where we're going to maximize human well-being. Somewhere in the middle, we're going to find out how to organize human energy along libertarian lines so that we do not invoke either tyranny or freedom. Many people look at a libertarian and wonder if he is a person on the extreme right or a person on the extreme left. I'd like to suggest that a libertarian is a person in the extreme middle, and that's where we are. We want to understand what the truth is and work to make a maximization of human well-being. Thanks very much.